Hello, and welcome to Conscious Curiosities, where we unlock the wisdom of the universe which lies within us. I'm Maria Luz, your host, a certified hypnotist, astrologer, and developing psychic medium. Today's episode is What the Dwarf Planets Sedna and Ceres Can Teach Us About Cancel Culture, Part 1. We're going to be exploring the following topics. Have you experienced life changes over the last year or so? Are you evolving towards your purpose or resisting? And how is that going for you? Are the archetypes of the new dwarf planets and asteroids pointing to dualities we experience as part of the human condition? I will also talk about the significance of Sedna in astronomy, mythology, and astrology, as I typically do when I go in deep with a certain planet. And I'll also talk about the lessons that Sedna may bring to our individual and collective evolution. So I will get into all the details about Sedna, but the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because Sedna moved into the sign of Gemini on April 27th, and Sedna had been in Taurus since May 11th, 1966. And once Sedna moved into Gemini, it immediately made a trine aspect, which is this like flow of energy aspect, usually in a collegial way with Pluto in Aquarius. And then within the space of a week and a half, all in May, the Sun on May 20th, Venus on May 24th, and then Jupiter on May 26th will all come into conjunction with Sedna. And just so you know, I'll talk about it more later, but basically all of recorded human history only goes back to Sedna being in Libra. So only 6 months of a Sedna year because of its super elongated kind of egg-shaped orbit. So we have never experienced Sedna in the sign of Gemini, so we don't know what to expect. But what I've read so far is just so fascinating. I wanted to share it. First, I wanted to give a little bit of just current astrological context. Throughout the time that the nodes of the moon have been in Libra and Aries, and this has been since July of 2023, as well as through these last few eclipse seasons. So looking back to March, April of last year, and then the eclipse season last October, and then finally the more recent and popularized one, I guess, because of the total solar eclipse that people could see in the US. So because of all that focus around the nodes of the moon and then the actual moon and the sun with the eclipses and the signs that those eclipses happened in and the nodes are in, there have definitely been some themes coming out. And some are around the self and other, and those involve these themes of attachment and detachment and how we face solitude, how we navigate connection. And with the recent focus in Taurus, that brings in these themes related to nature and resources and reaping what we sow. And I think Sedna will provide even deeper lessons on all of these subjects. The other important happening has been Chiron. And if you remember, Chiron is an asteroid, and it relates to our core wounding and really an intrinsic wounding, and then how we can make ourselves whole again through the healing work that we do. And that healing work often involves some kind of mentoring or helping service to others. So Chiron has been holding steady near the north node of the moon. So it also is folded into these themes I was just talking about and brings in that concept of healing and service to the collective. Now, these three celestial bodies, Chiron and Sedna and Ceres, they're all in that asteroid belt that is between Earth and Mars. And they've made these noticeable shifts in their positions, either like Chiron coming into contact with other objects for some time. And Ceres has been doing that as well lately, and I'll talk about Ceres next week. But because they've been doing these kind of shifts since we were able to see them in the sky, which would have been starting kind of in the late 18th century when the telescope was invented. But so we've been able to see them, and then we correlate their positioning, again, seeing them through the telescope just since the late 1700s. And we attach that to what's happening, which is mundane astrology, so kind of what's happening with the people as a whole. And then additionally, with personal events. So astrologers look at, okay, what's happening with clients or celebrities? And we gather that data. So as opposed to, the outer planets that are seen with the visible eye, those have been gathering this type of data since, the Mesopotamians, like several thousand years ago. So even though we have, more than 250 or so years of observation, we're still learning about, what these archetypes are. And Sedna is very much in that camp because, like I said, Sedna's orbit makes it such that it can spend hundreds or thousands of years in any one sign or aspect, making a certain aspect to another planet. So back to Sedna being in Gemini. Remember, Mercury rules Gemini, and Mercury is about perception. And I know you're also thinking, communication and thinking, but that is at its core perception. So as I started thinking about this, I was struck with this vast selection of what we spend our perception energy on. And I think rather than using time as a measure of bandwidth, I was choosing this idea of perception energy as a measurement of bandwidth because there's only so much we can take in through our senses and process intellectually, but perhaps more importantly, emotionally. And we're not supercomputers after all. So there is a limit to this bandwidth. For example, we had recent exciting happenings in the cosmos, seen in the sky with that total solar eclipse in North America and the massive solar flares and the northern lights being visible farther south than is typical. And also people reported seeing colors that they don't normally see in the aurora borealis. Yet at the same time, there are these significant wars and human rights issues that are continuing in the Ukraine and now in Israel and Gaza. And so there is this no end to, events and people vying for attention. And you think about not just those, major significant human caused and cosmos caused items that are vying for perception, but all those other people who are trying to get our money on, TikTok and Instagram, etc. And maybe they're not directly trying to get our money, but advertisers are putting their ads on these people, and people are trying to get sponsorships, etc., etc. So there's a lot of competition for our perception energy. So at some point, to me, it's not really time anymore, but it is this mercurial item that we need to consider as a measure. And then also with this this astrological energy that's happening and this Gemini or Mercury energy, I've heard and experienced some of this duality and these almost, these what seem like opposite ways to perceive things, but when you look more closely, they're two sides of the same coin, and there's the same root at them. And some have been just, I've seen a lot of relationships and in the last year or so that in many cases for good cause, so that people could be liberated and really free to be themselves. Yet we also see this, what's being called like an epidemic of loneliness. So there are those two things, and they're both true. And but we know that there's also a way that you can be lonely with other people, and there's a way that you cannot feel alone when you are in solitude. So so that's just one, and there's also a focus about how we use boundaries, and there was some confusion about those, I think, in social media, and that they were interpreted as really keeping other people out or keeping other people controlled, but what they're really about is maintaining our sense of control over our environment, by empowering ourselves to make decisions about who gets our energy and who doesn't, and things like that. And then maybe somewhat related are these, who gets canceled for certain behaviors and who gets a pass, and having to look at that. I mean, there's so many examples there that I could bring up, but then also these other kind of social mores that are being pushed upon, like Martha Stewart, being in the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition at 81 years old. But at the same time, these celebrities are still taking, those semaglutides, and they're having all this surgery to continue to look like they're, 18 years old. And so, like, how does our brain hold these two perceptions? So these things, to me, they feel very Gemini in nature, as well as touching upon those other concepts about self and other, and self-worth and internal versus external validation. So keep these concepts in mind as we begin to explore Sedna. Most of this material that I'm going to be covering, it comes from this book called Sedna Consciousness, The Soul's Path of Destiny by Alan Clay. And then the astronomy, I mostly have pulled from space.com, and then finally, when I talk about the mythology, I'll mention the primary source that I used to to summarize that as well a little bit later. So Sedna is a candidate dwarf planet, which has a huge egg-shaped orbit, and it's found far beyond any planet in our solar system. So if we were to measure it in Earth years, it would be 11,400 Earth years away from us. So it's one of the most distant objects that can be seen. And the discovery of Sedna in 2003, along with other similar objects, resulted in Pluto's demotion from a planet to a dwarf planet in 2006. And Sedna is described as the second reddest object in our solar system behind Mars. And scientists think that the extremely elongated orbit indicates an encounter with some other object that is no longer there, and that it could probably tell us something about our own sun, but it's kind of hard because Sedna only exists as kind of this unique object, so we can't really get any kind of data set on it. But its last close pass to the Earth was like the end of the last ice age, and its next closest pass is going to be in 2070. So when you look at that time scale, it's coming up soon. I'm sure I won't be here, but others will. And this last ice age on Earth, it was also the beginning of agriculture under the Neolithic Revolution. So during this time, there was a wide-scale change in how humans were humaning. And we went from this hunter-gatherer to being able to put down roots way of existing. And it was the start of this radical modification of the natural environment with things like crop rotation, irrigation, deforestation, things like that. And after that, there were settlements and the ability to have surplus food and create art that could stay in one place, have trade, have administrations, depersonalized systems of knowledge were created during this time. So really, the basis for humans to live together in these populated areas, and that created a need for specialization and for economic, political, and ultimately hierarchic foundations that would support this new way of living. And as I mentioned in the beginning, our whole known human history has been in the last Sedna year. And the recorded history has been only in the last Sedna 6 months. So we don't know, a lot, but I'll talk a little bit about just correlating from the time of recorded history and the sign that Sedna was in. So when Sedna was in Libra, that was when the Sumerian cities and then later the Bronze Age began. And then around 3000 BCE, Sedna was in Scorpio. And that's when, of course, I should have mentioned, with Libra, that has to do with, the other and with relationships. And with what you value and beauty. And so those things about how humans are going to live together and then, what we're going to show value with, those began. And then once Sedna entered Scorpio, that's when ancient Egypt culture rose, which was in many ways a cult around the dead. And, look at the big burial places in the pyramids, and everything that all the riches that were buried with the kings. And then in Sagittarius, there were these themes of law and higher education and philosophy. Those are all Sagittarius things and coincide with the rise of ancient Greece. And then Sedna was in Aries in starting in 1865. And again, see how because of that really long egg-shaped orbit, it just, some signs it's in for these huge swaths of time. And then you'll see some of these shorter periods starting now with Aries. And Aries is associated with war, and this is when the world wars started and the rise of nuclear capabilities. And then Sedna and Taurus began, as I mentioned in the beginning, in May of 1966. And from this time, we've seen, Taurus has to do with resource, and we've seen this big focus on capitalism and material wealth being concentrated in certain sectors, and just this pursuit of stuff, all this cheap stuff that comes over on barges and goes into Walmart and Target and ends up in your kids' rooms, and on and on and on. So that's really all the history that we know because of Sedna's orbit. So that is why I think it's such a big deal, and I haven't seen that much about it at least in the different astrology podcasts and things that I listen to. But Sedna will be in Gemini until 2068. And again, that's right about when it makes that close pass to Earth, or the closest that we've seen it. So in that book, Alan Clay, the author, he raises some of these Mercury and Gemini themes of communication, perception, and AI, because some of those precursors were set down around that time of Sedna's discovery in 2003, with the development of neural networks. Okay, so some of the themes that are explored in that book and elsewhere that I found as I've gone down my Sedna rabbit hole, they have to do with a surrender and trust in what awaits us beyond the familiar, tangible world, and a letting go of trauma and the state of victimhood in order to feel peace and purpose through using our gifts. So that's where I see this Sedna period picking up on some of this healing that we've been asked to do over the past almost 2 years. If we look at, the nodes moving into Aries and Libra in the summer of 2023, and Chiron being in Aries for what feels like forever. I can't remember off the top of my head right now when Chiron moved into Aries, but I know Chiron has passed over my natal Chiron, I think 4 times. Okay, so I also love to look at the mythology, and all the other times you've heard me talk about mythology, it's been the Greek and the Roman mythology, because all of the planets are, their archetypes are based on those mythologies because they were named after those Roman gods. However, Sedna is a departure from that. And Sedna is named after an Inuit goddess. And I found an episode of the podcast After Dark. I'll put a link in the show notes. But they interviewed Tia Tidwell, who is a professor of Alaska Native Studies at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And she belongs to the Nunavut people of the Inuktitut Pass. And Sedna was named after this Inuit goddess of the sea. And Sedna is a very powerful goddess. And she was, according to the myth, just extremely beautiful. And although some of the stories that have been passed down change slightly, what doesn't change is that her father told her she had to marry one of the strong men of the village, but she was in a relationship with a shapeshifter, which was not okay. And there are different versions of what basis that relationship was, but what doesn't change is that she did not agree to marry who she was supposed to. And so her father, or the people, take her out to sea, and either they push her or she falls, or she's thrown overboard, and she tries to climb back on, and her fingers are cut off one by one. And in some stories, her forearm as well. And as she sinks, she gives rise to all the sea mammals. And those sea mammals are what allowed the people in this remote part of the Arctic really to survive. They became food and shelter and warmth. So she became this sea goddess that's worshipped by hunters, because they depended on her goodwill, to supply them food and these sea mammals. And some of the interpretations of this myth focus on the victimization of Sedna by her power and her clinging, literally clinging to the boat, but clinging to the only reality she knew. And they kind of forget that there was this remarkable transcendence to become this benevolent goddess, nurturing all of these people, including the people who betrayed her. And those people became reliant on her. So it's pretty complicated. And I think, in addition to those themes about disempowerment and taking your own power back, there's a lot about grace and the human condition as well. And the Ellen Clay's book also mentions the work of Edgar Cayce, who was the father of holistic medicine, that, Sedna combines into one way of being, or one perspective, a few things: our ancestry, evolutionary change, and spiritual development in this one worldview. And I put that here, but I also want to be sensitive to the fact that Alaska is really complicated. I mean, there's all of this colonization and the taking of people and the land, and deciding that what is a frontier and like who are these pioneers, like just even thinking of those concepts that separate us from nature when we're really not. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there, that even though I try not to, I can't really help but have this Western view. That's because that's what has been dominant in the story that's been told in our culture. But I know that it's much deeper than that. So anyway, keep that in mind, that whole Westernization. But some of these keywords, and there are many more in this book, he used this astrologer named Dane Rudyard's concept of these 3 levels that a planet can operate on depending on the individual's level of consciousness. So that's why, like, when you have your chart reading, or even if you're looking at your, your big three, your sun, moon, and your rising, there, another person could have those same placements, but it really depends on the individual's level of consciousness, because we have free will. We're not, like I said, we're not computers, and it's not like this program is just put into us and it has to follow it. We do have free will, and so does everyone else who we interact with. So with those three levels, some of the keywords around Sedna are for that level of being unconscious to the energy: victimization, alienation, nurturing, resentment, personal blind spot. And then for individuals more on the spiritual path, radical acceptance, keeping our heart open in hell, nurturing our sense of humor, beating our drum and singing to life, and fated transcendence. And then at the spiritually evolved level, spiritual destiny, transcendent peace, nurturing abundance, allowing love and harmony, and transpersonal consciousness. I got chills when I looked up the Sabian symbol for Sedna's position. And I'll put a link in the show notes for Sabian symbols. That's another, I'll do an episode on that sometime because I love them so much. But basically there is a Sabian symbol, which is like a short kind of phrase, and then a short, almost like a poetic verse for every single degree of the zodiac. And so what you do is you round up, and then you read that passage. And so for Sedna being at 0 Gemini, we would round up to 1 Gemini, and it says, "A glass-bottomed boat reveals undersea wonders, and depth of realization in a consciousness constantly in touch with the sources of life, sensitiveness to collective images." So that, I could not believe how much that lined up with the mythology, but also what, I think those changes in the signs that Sedna has represented, and why I think Sedna is having been in Taurus and now moving into Gemini, right into that conversation with Pluto and Aquarius, which again is about more change and looking at how we relate to technology and what that means to us, as humans. And then having, the Sun and Venus and Jupiter immediately come into contact with Sedna in Gemini. Those Sabian symbol phrases really seem to capture that. And then Clay also notes that we might find that Sedna is a higher octave of Ceres, where the nurturing becomes transpersonal and spiritual, and across our current understanding of time and place. And I'll talk about Ceres next week, which is very much about the nurturing, but it also is fascinating with the story of her daughter Persephone and Pluto in the mythology, and then the different aspects that Ceres has been making as she moves around the sky lately. Okay, so that was a lot of nerdy astrology, and I thank you if you've listened to the whole thing. I'm doing this, yes, for myself, because I love researching all of this astrology, but I also want to empower people to use it in a way that interests them, and makes you think about things like evolution, and what the heck we are doing on this planet and with this planet, and part of nature, and technology also being maybe nature, or how we're going to blend those things. So anyway, if you want to personally work with me, you can visit my website, marialuz.online. You could email me, info@marialuz.online. And you can see on the website the different services, primarily astrology and hypnosis related, past life regression. I'm also working on my skills in tarot and mediumship and offering those for free if you want to sign up for that. And if you do like this, please follow it and leave a review. I think that really helps for other people to find this. And go ahead and check out the other episodes where I talk about astrology, and I also leave hypnotic tracks that I've been getting really good feedback on. And I also have content on YouTube. I wanted to do this podcast as a video podcast as well, but I think I'll just do that occasionally because the logistics in my house right now are a little bit complicated. So it's just easier for me to do these longer talks on audio only. But I do have a video, a quick astro energy forecast every Friday morning on my YouTube. And I have a really active Substack. I've been doing a lot of writing, and I'm trying to build some community there. And I'll have to think about how to get that to be more interactive. But for now, there's lots of writing that I send weekly if you subscribe to that. And I will also put the other sources in the show notes. I really appreciate you listening, and you are now empowered to become consciously curious about the asteroid and mythology of Sedna. Thank you.